Hello and welcome to Sprott Radio. I'm your host, Ed Coyne, Senior Managing Partner at Sprott Asset Management. I'm really excited today to welcome a new and special guest to Sprott Radio, Jan Emblemsvåg, who is a professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Jan, thank you for joining us on Sprott Radio.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, Jan, I have to tell you, when we were prepping for this, I was laughing because I talked to a lot of different people on Sprott Radio, but I rarely have a professor of your caliber on here. So I'm a little intimidated, I got to be honest with you, So I really appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with someone like myself. Well, let's go right into it because you got a really interesting and cool background. Talk a bit about kind of yourself, but also the research you're doing at the Norwegian University and really what got you to focus on nuclear technology.
Let's start with education. So I have my undergrad from Norwegian Institute of Technology in Trondheim, and then I took my master and PhD at Georgia Tech. I'm a mechanical engineering guy. I'm not nuclear, but a lot of people think that nuclear power is about nuclear, but there is actually a lot of mechanical engineering in nuclear. When I came back from the US in 1999, I started working as a consultant, and later on I became a manager and then ended up as a senior vice president. After that, I ventured over to marine industry. I was heading a shipyard. I was in the senior vice president in Rolls-Royce Marine with global responsibility for ship design and system integration. And the last job I had in the private sector was I was general manager for Midsund Bruk, who design and manufacturing pressure vessels for the oil and gas industry, very advanced pressure vessels. Then in 2020, I decided that after doing enough downsizing and firing a lot of people over the last 5 years, it was time to look at something more future oriented. And when in 2014, I think the whole zero emission shipping idea came up when I was at Rolls-Royce Marine. And back then I knew only of the pressurized water reactor, which is a very good workhorse, but it's too expensive for commercial marine. But then when I started as a professor, I soon learned about the molten salt reactor and other generation 4. And then I realized that this is something that really could do it. So that's what I've done research on for the last 4 years.
And, and speaking of research, you published a really interesting report as relates to different parts of the world, really trying to shift away from fossil fuels and nuclears towards renewables. And you focused on Germany as an example of being aspirational, but maybe not quite getting it right. It was a really interesting report, and you bring out some really, really cool stats on that. So talk about what inspired you to do that and dive into that report a bit and some of the findings that you came about.
Yeah, myself and a Swedish guy called Anders, we did first a study on the best 50 states in the US and Germany. It was more like a ranking kind of study. It wasn't doing the cost calculations. But that study showed that the best US states, Tennessee is one of them, actually outperformed Germany by a huge margin when it comes to both emission cuts and price levels in the grid. And they have gone for the nuclear path, whereas Germany have invested a lot in wind power, solar power, and also biomass. This study that you refer to, then I took it upon myself to try to do the difficult calculation of figuring out what the Energiewende, as the Germans call it, the energy transition, what has it cost? And of course, there is a lot of data, but there is a lot of missing data. So it was a very approximate study. So I had to use a method called triangulation, which is not the most accurate. And that's why I basically did the analysis using nominal terms. I didn't inflation adjust or anything. I didn't want anyone to believe that this was an accurate study. It's just ballpark. And then when you start to look into this, you realize that they have spent enormous amount of money on the energy transition. I came to around 700 billion euros.
Wow.
Yeah. And the way I did that was to estimate the cost of all the investments for all these power plants. And then I knew they had spent a huge amount of subsidies on making them competitive. Some of the subsidies also are purely more financial in nature. So there is some double counting in there. But in order to eliminate the double counting issue, I didn't include a lot of other costs. For example, the cost of extending the transmission network, the cost of prematurely closing down the nuclear power plants, the cost of people on the value-added tax, the fact that they have a higher mortality because of using coal and not nuclear, etc., etc. So I think when everything is said and done, the 700 billion euros is most likely a conservative estimate, I think.
And what time frame was this over when you were looking at this from the time they started this initiative to where we are today? What was the time frame of that?
It was 2002 through 2022, so it was 20 years.
Okay.
And after 20 years, it's kind of interesting, to figure out how it has worked. And then I took this 700 billion, and then first I tried to estimate what would it have costed Germany to keep the nuclear power they had in 2002 operational. And that was roughly 100 billion. And the interesting part is that if they had just done that, they would have produced as much power as of today. So the old nuke basically produced as much power as all the renewables put together in Germany today. But they would have saved 600 billion euros.
Right.
Yeah. Then, of course, some of these older nuclear power plants would have to be invested in later on and so on. But that comes after 2022. So then I asked myself, so what if Germany had pursued a strategy of actually building new ones, new nuclear power plants? And of course, if you look at the stats around the world, among OECD countries, for example, there's a huge variation of cost and construction time. So again, using triangulation as the approach, I basically triangulated myself to what I would call an average nuclear power plant, meaning basically a nuclear power plant that is average in terms of cost, average in construction time, and so on. And I used that, and then I came to the conclusion that with the time frame of 20 years, Germany could have built, I think it was 11 of these, and basically saved 300 some billion euros and reached their climate goals.
In your work then, are there other countries? I mean, you hear about how France is really the leader as far as nuclear. Can you talk about other countries that have maybe had more success relative to Germany, and then maybe expand on that? And what is Germany doing about this going forward?
Well, I think it was Václav Smil who actually wrote that the US has achieved the same result as Germany with a fraction of the cost, basically using natural gas. So that's one version. The French, they did a very rapid scaling of nuclear in the 80s, early 90s. And they are, of the big countries in the world, having the cleanest grid because of that. If you look at the emissions in Germany versus France, you will see that France typically around 50 gram per megawatt hour or something like that, whereas Germany is 8, 9, 10 times worse sometimes. And that is because the challenge with solar power and also wind power is that it's non-synchronous power, meaning it cannot sustain frequency and voltage. That's the fundamental issue. The other fundamental issue is lack of storage. But from a technical point of view, the lack of synchronization means that in order to not have a blackout in the grid, you need to have enough synchronous energy sources to stabilize the grid. And there are only two clean synchronous energy sources. It's nuclear and it's hydropower. And Germany doesn't have enough hydropower for them to kind of stabilize the grid. And since they had closed down the nuclear, they were forced to run gas and coal.
They went backwards effectively.
Yeah, I think so. They should have kept the nuke and closed down the coal.
I think the big takeaway so far in all the podcasts we've done and the research papers we've done, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is that the mistake is one versus another. Is areas like Germany starting to kind of loosen the grip on one versus the other and starting to think, okay, what are our options out there? What are you seeing in the research you're doing right now? And what I just said, does that make sense? Or are you seeing still this one versus the other mentality?
I wrote a paper on Ireland, actually. Ireland is a very interesting case because they have the highest amount of non-synchronous power on a synchronous grid, and it's wind power. And Ireland has to curtail the wind when it reaches about 70% of the grid. And the problem with Germany is that they have so much wind and so much solar capacity that when there is wind and sun, it's massive overproduction. But they need to maintain the synchronicity. So the coal or the gas or the hydro, or if they had nuke, would still need to run. So that means that there is probably an upper limit of what's sensible to put into the grid of non-synchronous power. For example, Sweden, they follow a strategy of 1/3 of each. 1/3 nuclear, 1/3 hydro, 1/3 renewables. I think that sounds like a good one because that means that the renewables will not be able to overproduce and therefore drive the grid into negative pricing area, because the synchronicity must be maintained. Otherwise, we have a huge blackout.
That brings up the next question, which I guess is storage, right? We don't have the technology yet or the capacity to take that overproduction, store it, and use it later.
No.
So we have to consume it as we produce it effectively.
Yeah, that's true. And that's because of the sheer volume of power on the grid. Germany had a so-called Dunkelflaute in December 2022. And a Dunkelflaute, that's a German word for dark, cold, and windless.
That sounds awful.
Yeah, but it's very common in winter in Northern Europe and probably Northern Canada and the US too. And what happened then is that you have no sun or very, very little, and you have no wind, but you have a very high demand because of the cold weather. In December 2022, they had 16 days of this, consecutive days. If you took the biggest grid battery in the world, Moss Landing Energy Storage Facility in California, you would need 3,800 such batteries to handle that Dunkelflaute at the whopping cost of $1,200 billion. Obviously, it's not a good idea. To keep nuclear power is dirt cheap in comparison.
So what did they do in those 16 days? What actually happened?
Then they spiked up all the fossil stuff they had and imported from France, of course.
Yeah. They did. So they were buying energy from France. They were using, were they using coal?
Oh, yes. Germany is using 10,000 tons of coal per hour.
Wow. So they're really going the opposite direction of what their initiative is, it sounds like. And I hate to pick on Germany, but...
No, but it is a good case because it's a big country. Mm-hmm. Very small countries like Norway and Iceland, we always can find a way because we don't need really so much in the big scale of things. But a big country like Germany, they need to have a much more industrial approach towards energy.
What are they doing about that going forward? Are you seeing them rethink this policy? Are they readdressing their thoughts on nuclear going forward?
Yeah, the former government party, CDU, which is not in government now, but they have actually stated that they would like to reintroduce nuclear to Germany. They see that the process that Angela Merkel led with the downsizing and closure of nuclear has been a big mistake.
Interesting.
Yeah, I hope that they will do that because the challenge with Germany is that it used to be a power surplus in Germany, but now it's actually a deficit. So Germany is now importing a lot from the countries around, driving the prices up. For example, in Norway, we are exporting a lot of energy to Germany, but because of the German grid is very large, they have brought up the prices in Norway and all the countries around.
A lot of this energy transition tends to get focused on the 1 billion of the 8 billion people, right? And the other 7 billion, you hear people say, well, I don't really care if my power comes from coal or wind or solar or nuclear. I just want my electricity to actually light my light bulbs because it's the first time I have electricity in a house.
Yeah.
It will be interesting
Yeah.
to see how that progresses over time. Are you seeing anything in other parts of the world that are getting access to the grid for the first time? Do they care where their electricity is coming from? And if they do, what are they focused on?
The main issue for the part of the world that is electrifying is reliability.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take the villagers in the poor world, they are happy with just having some kind of electricity every now and then.
Wow.
And for them, you've had the off-grid solar panels has been a major positive effect, because even though they then have power half the day, it's a huge step forward compared to having no power at all.
Right.
But then if you look at these countries who have now done this kind of things and are starting to move towards industrialization, then they realize that you cannot run industry on wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a number of African countries, I think 15 of them, are now discussing nuclear. And we saw the Emirates, who invested in nuclear power plant built on record time with very, very low cost, South Korean made. So we see that there is a bigger and bigger quest for power, but reliability is an important determinant of which kind of power they choose, at least early on. In the mature economies that have been around, like say US or Germany and so on, there is already a lot of different kind of power sources.
Mm-hmm.
So their TSOs there has to do more like a portfolio kind of decision.
This report obviously has probably spurred a lot of other activity.
Yeah, and also some criticism. What
pushback are you getting, I guess, is the question I want to ask.
Yeah, the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, who has been part of the Energiewende, the energy transition, they commented that I did a lot of double counting, but I have answered them, and that's why I eliminated a lot of the other costs to avoid double counting. But apart from that, I've received a lot of very, very positive comments also from Germany, where they basically say that, this is a ballpark study, but this is something we need on the table to start discussing the options that are here. Because right now they're burning coal when they need synchronous power, or gas if they have it. Putin made the access of gas difficult. And I guess this is also one thing that's very good about nuclear power, is that you detach yourself from the whim of the security policies often associated with the fossil power.
Do you see yourself potentially going back to the private sector as a consultant to areas like Germany, maybe to help them solve this problem going forward? Would you be open to something like that?
Yes, I actually do a little bit consulting now, and I have some board positions. But most of my focus these days is actually on nuclear propulsion.
Talk about that a bit.
Yeah. Where I come from in Norway, we have a very vibrant maritime industry with ship owners, shipyards, suppliers of equipment, and the whole thing. And of course, these big ships are consuming a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
A big container ship will consume close to 3,000 megawatt hours per day. So that means it will take Moss Landing Energy Storage Facility, the biggest grid battery on the planet, and suck it dry in just one day. So that illustrates the problem with these big ships, that they consume so much energy that batteries is out, hydrogen is out.
Mm-hmm.
We are really into two major options: either continue as we do today or nuclear. I did an analysis of all the fuel consumption in the marine industry, and if this were to be replaced by green ammonia or any other hydrogen-based fuel, we would need all the power in all the OECD countries just to make the fuel. Obviously, will never work.
I've got a fun stat for you. Years ago, my son and I, we slept on the battleship New Jersey. He was part of the Boy Scouts, and it was the last ship in operation that was using diesel fuel. You probably know this stat. Most people don't. I use it all the time. But can you guess how far they got on 1 gallon of diesel fuel when they were cruising?
1 gallon? That's nothing. I don't know.
3 feet. 3 feet per gallon. It was over $1 million a day over 3 decades ago to cruise. So, nuclear has been part of moving big ships around for quite a while in the military application. But I did notice on your LinkedIn the article about cargo ships. And I'm surprised, frankly, that cargo ships aren't currently powered by nuclear. Talk about that and some of the work you're doing on that.
The thing is that because of the enormous energy required for the shipping industry, we had to find a way of doing it. But like I said, the pressurized water reactors that the military use, they are too expensive for commercial marine. But with the new Generation 4 reactors, we realized that this could be our solution. So we have a project running right now called Nupro Ship 1 that will, over New Year, go into Nupro Ship 2. And basically, we have investigated all the known reactor technologies in the world and came down to 3 that will actually do the job. One of them is a helium gas cooled reactor. The other one is a molten salt reactor, both of them with triso fuel. And the third one is a lead cooled reactor. All these reactors are small enough and provide enough power to make it relevant for our purpose. They are small, so they are easy to place. Costs are still a little bit too early to talk about, but preliminary studies I did on a molten salt reactor 4 years ago indicate we could actually do it cheaper than heavy fuel oil.
Interesting.
So we can actually save money on this. And then we are talking, because that means that once this is legal with all the licensing work and everything we have to do, it will outcompete the heavy fuel oil.
You mentioned South Korea. They come up a lot from a technology standpoint, from a construction standpoint on reactors. Are they really the leaders as relates to patents and designs and construction? Why do they keep coming up in so many conversations?
I think in terms of patents, they are not. Then probably the US have the biggest number of patents on all these kind of different reactor technologies. But the South Koreans are very good at building. We see that in the maritime industry too. They typically develop a design and then they build the same ship over and over and over again. And this is what they've done with the reactor. Whereas we in the West, let's take Hinkley Point C, for example, in the UK, which is a spectacular example of how not to do it. They buy a reactor technology from France. And the laws of physics in France and in the UK are exactly the same. Yet, when the same technology is moved to UK, they impose 7,000 changes on the design and the facility. And of course, the project guys who actually build it in Hinkley Point C, for them, this is a massive amount of extra work. And it makes everything so much more difficult than just use the same thing that has been built before. And this we do in the West. And also we have, for example, in the US, in some states, you could cancel a project up to 95% completion. Imagine that kind of risk, financial risk.
Yeah.
And you have different consortium, different agreements. Every nuclear power plant is basically a prototype in one way or the other.
So we keep reinventing the wheel. I mean, we're the Koreans. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. So how do we get everybody on the same page then?
I think that the most important thing we can do is to take politics out of nuclear. So when we have a project, let the guys who run the project do it. And keep the politicians away and all the other guys who have their wishes about this and that and so on. That would be one huge step going forward. What's really interesting about the maritime industry is the number of reactors is so vast. We are talking about 2,000 ships per year.
Wow.
The US Navy is like 600 some ships. But here we're talking about 2,000 every year. And this will mean that in the marine industry, you can really, really industrialize nuclear to a level not seen in any other domain. And that will, of course, have huge spillover effect on land. And then the land-based nuclear power plants should become much, much, much more cheaper than they are today. But we do have to take the politics out of this. We cannot have every regulator and every politician, every company and everyone do it their way, because then everything becomes prototypes.
Well, that might take a miracle then, it sounds like. You're talking to an American. We love our politics over here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting the politicians to step aside will be a challenge in itself. You figure that one out, there might be a Nobel Prize in there for you. Could be your greatest achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think if they can realize that by doing that, they will actually serve themselves and everybody else.
But what do you say to those that are still concerned about the safety of nuclear power going forward? What has changed in technology, and what would you say to someone that would bring that up?
They probably have in mind Chernobyl and some of these early accidents, which were very old-fashioned. We call them Generation 2 nuclear power plants. And if something that's built today is not even remotely close to that in terms of safety levels. So that's one thing. But perhaps the most important thing about the Chernobyl accident was the historical context and lack of safety culture. In Soviet Union, they have a decree that stated that nuclear power plants cannot fail. And because of that, there were no training for what to do. There were not even equipment or anything. And of course, then when they do have an accident, this accident become much, 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 much worse than it would have done in any Western facility if it could have happened at all. But the reactors that we built in the West since 90s and upgraded the older one, they are super, super, super safe.
So the existing plants, can you talk about now, we hear about this a lot
Yeah.
now, that existing plants are having their operating license extended. So older
Yes.
plants are operating, but those have been retrofitted or upgraded as well from a safety standard.
Yes, they have. And then, of course, if we move on to what I work on, which is Generation 4, those reactors are on even a higher level of safety. For example, a molten salt reactor has no pressure. And with no pressure, there cannot be an explosion. Simply physically impossible.
Okay.
And with no explosion, that means that if you do have an accident, the radioactive material would be confined to the concrete sarcophagus around the reactor. So that means even if everything failed, it cannot be an accident.
Because there's no pressure in the Gen 4 type of reactor.
Exactly. Yeah, for that kind of Gen 4. There are other Gen 4 reactors with pressure, but that has really, really, really advanced safety systems. When we did our sorting for the ships, we really looked at worst kind of case. We want to have a reactor that can withstand just about anything. And for that reason, we also have the TRISO fuel. And the TRISO fuel is really a game changer in terms of safety, because that means that all the radioactive material is contained in a ceramic graphite pellet or something like that. And because of that, it cannot not spread. It's impossible to spread it around, like what happened with Chernobyl when the explosion threw the radioactive isotopes around the facility.
Right.
That could never happen.
So I do want to talk about how we can keep track of you and how we can follow some of the work you're doing and the research that you're posting out there.
I guess the easiest way is just LinkedIn. When I write an article, I normally share it there if it's a scientific article.
Is there anything else that maybe I didn't ask that you think is really interesting that would be worth mentioning today?
No, I really spend all my research time, or not all, but most on the nuclear propulsion part, simply because of the enormous potential. We are talking about the market that will be bigger than land-based nuclear today.
Wow. Yeah, this was really, really cool. I might be mildly more confused than I was before the call because you just introduced so many new things to me. But I think our listeners are really engaged in kind of the future of what nuclear means for them personally and for the economy and from an investment standpoint. So we really appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you so much for joining us on Sprott Radio.
Oh, thank you. It was very interesting.
And once again, my name's Ed Coyne, and you're listening to Sprott Radio.
This podcast is provided for information purposes only from sources believed to be reliable. However, Sprott does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Any opinions and estimates constitute our judgment as of the date of this material and are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not indicative of future results. This communication is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. Any opinions and recommendations herein do not take into account individual client circumstances, objectives, or needs, and are not intended as recommendations of particular securities, financial instruments, or strategies. You must make your own independent decisions regarding any securities, financial instruments, or strategies mentioned mentioned or related to the information herein. This communication may not be redistributed or retransmitted in whole or in part or in any form or manner without the express written consent of Sprott. Any unauthorized use or disclosure is prohibited. Receipt and review of this information constitutes your agreement not to redistribute or retransmit the contents and information contained in this communication without first obtaining express permission from an authorized officer of Sprott.